In the early hours of April 25, 1974, a quiet military coup unfolded in Portugal that would unravel one of Europe's oldest dictatorships and accelerate the collapse of a global empire. And what made the Carnation Revolution extraordinary was not only its speed or its relative absence of violence, but the way it exposed how deeply the Cold War had reshaped Western alliances, colonial policy, and the limits of authoritarian stability within NATO itself. Because Portugal was not a peripheral state drifting between blocs, but a founding member of the Atlantic Alliance whose regime had survived for decades by presenting itself as a reliable anti-communist bulwark. And this mattered because the revolution demonstrated that ideological alignment with the West could no longer compensate for political stagnation, economic exhaustion, and the unsustainable burden of imperial war. And the roots of this collapse lay in the Estado Novo system, established under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a corporatist dictatorship that combined censorship, political repression, and colonial ambition into a rigid structure that resisted reform even as the post-war world moved toward decolonization. And although Salazar himself was removed from power by illness in 1968, the system endured under his successor, Marcelo Caetano, who attempted limited modernization without surrendering authoritarian control, a balancing act that satisfied neither reformers nor hardliners and left the regime trapped between inertia and collapse. And this tension was magnified by Portugal's colonial wars in Africa, which by the late 1960s had become the defining feature of the state's existence, as Lisbon fought simultaneous counterinsurgency campaigns in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau against nationalist movements supported materially and diplomatically by the socialist bloc. And these wars mattered enormously in the Cold War context because they transformed Portugal's empire into a proxy arena where decolonization, Marxist ideology, and Western strategic interests collided. Yet unlike Britain or France, Portugal refused to negotiate withdrawal, committing itself to perpetual war that consumed resources, manpower, and legitimacy. And by the early 1970s, the burden had become unbearable, as conscription drained young officers into endless campaigns with no prospect of victory, while economic isolation and international condemnation deepened Portugal's stagnation, creating a growing disconnect between the regime's claims of national destiny and the lived reality of exhaustion and futility. And it was within the armed forces that this contradiction became most acute, because junior officers who had fought in Africa returned disillusioned, aware that they were enforcing a colonial order that lacked both moral justification and strategic viability. And this awareness crystallized into the armed forces movement, a clandestine network of officers who initially mobilized around professional grievances, but quickly recognized that the wars themselves were the root cause of institutional decay. And this recognition mattered because it transformed a military protest into a political conspiracy aimed not merely at changing policy, but at dismantling the regime that sustained it. And when the coup was finally launched, it unfolded with almost surreal calm, as units loyal to the movement seized key installations, broadcast coded signals over state radio, and advanced through Lisbon without resistance, revealing how hollow the dictatorship had become. Because the security services, political police, and loyalist units either stood aside or collapsed under the realization that the regime no longer commanded loyalty even within its own coercive apparatus, and the image that would come to symbolize the revolution, civilians placing carnations into soldiers' rifle barrels, captured this collapse of authority with haunting clarity, because it showed a population that no longer feared the state and a military that no longer believed in repressing it. And this mattered profoundly in Cold War terms, because it shattered the assumption that NATO's southern flank was politically immutable. exposing how an alliance built on shared security interests could contain radically divergent internal systems. And as the regime fell, Caetano surrendered power without meaningful resistance, confirming that the dictatorship's survival had depended less on strength than on the absence of alternatives. And once those alternatives emerged, the system disintegrated almost instantly. And yet the revolution did not produce immediate clarity, because the collapse of authoritarian control opened a volatile transitional period in which competing visions for Portugal's future clashed openly. And this volatility mattered because it transformed Portugal into one of the most ideologically contested spaces in Europe during the mid-1970s, as communist, socialist, and conservative forces struggled to shape the post-dictatorship order, while the military itself remained a central political actor, divided between factions that saw the revolution as a path toward Western-style democracy and those who viewed it as an opportunity for socialist transformation aligned with the Eastern Bloc. And this internal struggle unfolded against the backdrop of intense international scrutiny, because both Washington and Moscow recognized that Portugal's trajectory could alter the strategic balance in Western Europe, particularly given its control of Atlantic sea lanes and its role within NATO. And for the United States, the revolution posed a delicate dilemma, because overt intervention risked delegitimizing democratic forces, while inaction risked allowing communist influence to expand within a member state. And this tension revealed how the Cold War constrained even victorious alliances, forcing them to navigate transitions without clear tools for control. And meanwhile, the most immediate and irreversible consequence of the revolution unfolded overseas, as Portugal's African empire collapsed with astonishing speed, because the new political reality in Lisbon made continued colonial war impossible, leading to rapid decolonization that transformed Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe into independent states almost overnight. And this decolonization mattered enormously because it injected fresh instability into regions already shaped by Cold War rivalry, turning Portugal's imperial collapse into a catalyst for new proxy conflicts that would draw in the United States, the Soviet Union, Cuba, and regional actors, ensuring that the Carnation Revolution's impact extended far beyond Europe. And within Portugal itself, the unraveling of empire intensified domestic uncertainty, as returning settlers, economic disruption, and ideological polarization tested the capacity of new institutions to govern. And yet, despite these pressures, the revolutionary period gradually stabilized into a democratic framework, a process that demonstrated both the risks and resilience of rapid political transformation in the Cold War environment. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution stands as a pivotal Cold War event, not because it involved superpower confrontation or mass violence, but because it revealed how internal exhaustion, colonial overreach, and military disillusionment could collapse an authoritarian system embedded within the Western alliance, forcing NATO to confront the reality that ideological alignment could not indefinitely substitute for political legitimacy. And by unraveling one of Europe's last empires while reshaping the balance of power in Africa and testing the cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance, the Portuguese Carnation Revolution exposed a fundamental truth of the Cold War, that the stability of blocs depended not only on external deterrence, but on the internal sustainability of the regimes that composed them. And when that sustainability failed, even the most entrenched systems could fall with breathtaking speed. As the initial euphoria of the Carnation Revolution gave way to the realities of governing a dismantled dictatorship, Portugal entered a prolonged period of political uncertainty that revealed how fragile revolutionary consensus could be once authoritarian control disappeared. And this mattered because the fall of the Estado Novo had removed the institutional constraints that had suppressed conflict without providing a ready-made framework to manage it, transforming the country into a laboratory for Cold War political competition within a Western alliance state. And in the months following April 1974, power shifted repeatedly between civilian politicians and the military officers of the armed forces movement, whose unity during the coup quickly fractured as ideological differences surfaced, with moderate officers seeking a rapid transition to parliamentary democracy clashing with radical factions who believed the revolution should culminate in a socialist transformation of Portuguese society. And this internal struggle mattered enormously because it unfolded at a moment when Western Europe was already experiencing political turbulence, making Portugal's trajectory a test case for whether democratic consolidation could succeed under conditions of economic crisis, decolonization shock, and intense ideological polarization. And the stakes were heightened by the presence of the Portuguese Communist Party, one of the most disciplined and influential communist organizations in Western Europe, which moved swiftly to organize labor, influence the military, and shape the direction of the transition, prompting fears in Washington and other NATO capitals that Portugal might drift out of the Western camp, not through invasion, but through internal realignment. And these fears mattered because they exposed the limits of Cold War. Alliance structures, which were designed to deter external threats but were poorly equipped to manage internal ideological shifts among member states, and as strikes, land occupations, and nationalizations spread across Portugal in 1974 and 1975, the revolutionary process accelerated in unpredictable ways, with factories seized by workers, banks and major industries brought under state control, and media outlets becoming battlegrounds for competing narratives, creating an atmosphere in which political legitimacy was contested daily rather than assumed. And this volatility mattered because it demonstrated how quickly the collapse of authoritarian control could unleash social forces long suppressed, forces that did not align neatly with the preferences of either superpower, but nevertheless became entangled in Cold War calculations. And within the military, the divisions deepened, as radical officers aligned with leftist movements argued that the revolution's survival required breaking decisively with Portugal's past and resisting Western pressure, while moderates warned that such a course risked economic isolation and international confrontation. A debate that mirrored the broader Cold War tension between ideological ambition and pragmatic constraint. And for the United States, the situation posed a strategic dilemma because overt intervention risked validating radical claims of imperial interference, while passivity risked allowing a key NATO member to slide toward a political orientation incompatible with alliance cohesion. And this dilemma mattered because it revealed how the Cold War increasingly constrained Western policy, not through military threat, but through political uncertainty within allied states, forcing Washington to rely on indirect influence, economic signals, and quiet diplomacy rather than force. And as 1975 unfolded, the revolutionary process reached its most dangerous phase, with failed coups, counter-coups, and mass mobilizations suggesting that Portugal could tip into prolonged instability or authoritarian reversal from either the left or the right. And this sense of imminent breakdown underscored how the Carnation Revolution, despite its peaceful origins, carried the latent potential for violent fragmentation, a potential shaped by the unresolved legacies of dictatorship, colonial war, and abrupt decolonization. And yet, even in this period of maximum uncertainty, the absence of large-scale violence remained striking, because political actors across the spectrum recognized that escalation could trigger external intervention or irreversible collapse, creating an environment in which restraint was enforced not by institutions, but by mutual fear of catastrophe. And this restraint mattered because it allowed Portugal to navigate a path that avoided the fate of many Cold War transitions, where internal conflict became proxy war. And as the balance gradually shifted toward moderate forces committed to pluralist democracy, the revolutionary period began to close, not with a decisive victory by any faction, but with a negotiated redefinition of power that re-anchored Portugal within the Western democratic framework. And this outcome revealed that the Carnation Revolution's most enduring legacy was not ideological triumph, but institutional reinvention, demonstrating that even under intense Cold War pressure, a state emerging from dictatorship could avoid both civil war and superpower domination, though only by absorbing immense social and political strain. And in this sense, the post-revolutionary struggle was as significant as the coup itself, because it showed that the true challenge of the Carnation Revolution lay not in toppling an exhausted regime, but in constructing legitimacy from the ruins it left behind, a process shaped as much by global rivalry as by domestic aspiration. As Portugal moved deeper into the mid-1970s, the struggle over the revolution's direction increasingly centered on the question of legitimacy, because while the dictatorship had collapsed decisively, no single faction could credibly claim the authority to define the new order alone. And this mattered because legitimacy in a revolutionary environment was not inherited, but contested, shaped through demonstrations, elections, and control of institutions rather than through force. And during this period, the armed forces movement gradually lost its role as a unifying arbiter, as its internal divisions became public and its capacity to govern coherently eroded, forcing political power to migrate toward civilian institutions, even as uncertainty persisted. And this migration mattered because it marked the beginning of a decisive shift away from military tutelage, reducing the risk that Portugal would become trapped in a cycle of coups and counter-coups that had plagued other Cold War transitions. And the turning point came as elections for a constituent assembly demonstrated broad popular support for pluralism rather than revolutionary authoritarianism, revealing that despite months of upheaval, the Portuguese electorate favored democratic normalization over ideological experimentation, and this result mattered enormously because it undercut claims by radical factions that they embodied the will of the people, rebalancing the political field and strengthening moderate forces committed to constitutional governance. And at the international level, this shift eased pressure on Western allies, because it suggested that Portugal would remain within NATO not by coercion, but by democratic choice, reinforcing the argument that legitimacy could anchor alliance cohesion more effectively than intervention. And as civilian authority consolidated, the military's political role receded, not through purges or confrontation, but through gradual institutional withdrawal, a process that reflected the broader lesson of the Carnation Revolution, that restraint and compromise could succeed where force might have failed, and this mattered because it demonstrated an alternative pathway for Cold War political change, one that avoided both repression and revolutionary excess. And yet, even as Portugal stabilized internally, the consequences of rapid decolonization continued to reverberate externally, because the sudden withdrawal from Africa left power vacuums that quickly filled with armed movements and foreign intervention, transforming Angola and Mozambique into major Cold War battlegrounds, whose conflicts were shaped by superpower rivalry and regional ambition. And this external fallout mattered because it revealed the paradox of Portugal's peaceful transition, that while the revolution avoided large-scale violence at home, it contributed indirectly to prolonged wars abroad, underscoring how decolonization in the Cold War often redistributed violence rather than eliminating it. And within Portugal, the return of settlers from Africa, economic dislocation, and the challenge of integrating a new political class tested the resilience of democratic institutions. Yet the absence of authoritarian relapse demonstrated that the social exhaustion produced by decades of dictatorship and war had created a powerful incentive for stability, reinforcing commitment to constitutional rule. And as the revolutionary period drew to a close, Portugal's reintegration into Western Europe accelerated, culminating in deeper economic and political ties that anchored the country firmly within a democratic framework. And this outcome mattered because it showed that NATO's internal transformation did not weaken the alliance, but ultimately strengthened it by replacing an authoritarian member with a democratic one, even as the process exposed vulnerabilities and risks along the way. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution must be understood as a Cold War event whose significance lay not only in regime change, but in the demonstration that ideological alignment could be renegotiated through democratic choice rather than imposed through force, reshaping how legitimacy, alliance, and sovereignty interacted in a bipolar world, and by navigating a path between authoritarian collapse and ideological capture. Portugal illustrated that even amid intense global rivalry, internal political exhaustion and collective restraint could produce outcomes that neither superpower fully controlled, revealing a quieter but profound dimension of Cold War change. As the revolutionary turbulence subsided and Portugal's new constitutional order took shape, the deeper Cold War significance of the Carnation Revolution became clearer, because it demonstrated that the most destabilizing pressures within the Western alliance did not necessarily come from external enemies, but from the internal contradictions of regimes sustained by strategic necessity rather than popular consent. And this mattered because Portugal's dictatorship had survived for decades not through legitimacy, but through usefulness, tolerated by Western partners because it delivered stability, anti-communism, and access to strategic geography, a bargain that collapsed once the costs of imperial war and domestic stagnation outweighed its value. And this collapse exposed how Cold War alliances often masked internal fragility, relying on authoritarian partners whose endurance depended on suppressing rather than resolving social conflict. And when that suppression failed, the resulting vacuum created uncertainty that no alliance doctrine could easily manage. And in Portugal, this uncertainty was compounded by the speed of decolonization, which not only transformed Africa, but also reshaped Portuguese society itself, forcing a rapid redefinition of national identity from imperial power to European democracy. A transition that carried psychological as well as economic consequences. And this mattered because it revealed how empire had functioned as a stabilizing myth for the dictatorship, providing purpose and cohesion even as it drained resources, and once empire vanished, the ideological scaffolding of the regime collapsed with it, leaving behind a society eager to redefine itself, but uncertain of its place in a divided world. And within NATO, the Portuguese experience served as an implicit warning, highlighting the risks of equating alignment with stability and showing that alliances built on strategic convenience could face sudden internal upheaval when legitimacy eroded. And this lesson mattered because it challenged assumptions about the durability of the Western Bloc, revealing that cohesion depended not only on deterrence and military integration, but on the political sustainability of member states. And at the same time, the revolution demonstrated that such upheaval did not inevitably lead to alignment with the Eastern Bloc, undermining simplistic Cold War binaries that equated social change with communist takeover. And this nuance was crucial because it showed that popular exhaustion with authoritarianism could coexist with a desire for pluralism and Western integration. complicating superpower narratives that framed the world as a zero-sum ideological contest. And as Portugal stabilized and moved toward democratic consolidation, its experience subtly altered Western thinking about political change within allied states, reinforcing the idea that supporting democratic transitions could ultimately strengthen rather than weaken alliance cohesion, even if the process entailed short-term uncertainty. And this shift mattered because it foreshadowed later Cold War transitions, where legitimacy and reform would prove decisive in reshaping blocs without direct confrontation. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history, because it combined the collapse of dictatorship, the end of empire, and the renegotiation of alliance identity into a single, compressed moment, revealing how internal exhaustion and restraint could accomplish what external pressure could not. And as historians reassess the revolution, its importance lies not in dramatic violence or superpower showdown, but in the way it exposed the limits of authoritarian durability within a strategic alliance, and demonstrated that the Cold War's outcomes were shaped as much by internal legitimacy crises as by missiles and treaties, showing that even within NATO, systems sustained by fear and inertia could fall overnight once the social and military foundations that upheld them gave way. As the implications of the Carnation Revolution extended beyond Portugal's borders, its role as a catalyst for broader Cold War realignments became increasingly evident, because the sudden collapse of Lisbon's empire reshaped strategic calculations across Africa and forced both superpowers to confront the consequences of decolonization unfolding without negotiated transition. And this mattered because Portugal's withdrawal created power vacuums in Angola and Mozambique that rapidly escalated into full-scale proxy conflicts, drawing in Cuban forces, Soviet support, and Western countermeasures, transforming the end of empire into a new phase of Cold War competition. And while these conflicts unfolded thousands of miles from Lisbon, they were inseparable from the revolution itself, because the decision to abandon colonial war removed the final constraint that had held these territories in a precarious equilibrium, releasing forces that neither Portugal nor its allies could control. And this external fallout mattered because it demonstrated how internal political change within a European NATO state could trigger instability across entire regions, linking domestic legitimacy crises to global strategic outcomes. And within Western capitals, the lesson was sobering, as policymakers recognized that the collapse of authoritarian stability could produce ripple effects far beyond national borders, complicating the moral clarity of supporting democratic change, even as they acknowledged its necessity. And this tension underscored a central paradox of the Cold War, that the pursuit of legitimacy and reform could generate short-term instability, even as it promised long-term alignment. And in Portugal itself, the awareness of these consequences deepened the sense that the revolution had irrevocably altered the country's global role, forcing a reorientation away from imperial ambition toward European integration and Atlantic cooperation. And this reorientation mattered because it marked a fundamental shift in national identity, replacing the mythology of empire with the pragmatism of participation in a democratic Europe, a transition that reshaped political discourse and economic priorities throughout the late 1970s. And as democratic institutions matured, the revolutionary period receded into memory, yet its imprint remained visible in the caution with which political actors approached polarization and military involvement in politics, reflecting lessons learned from the near miss of ideological capture and internal fragmentation. And this institutional memory mattered because it contributed to the durability of Portugal's post-revolutionary democracy, anchoring it against the kinds of reversals that had followed earlier upheavals in other contexts. And in Cold War terms, The Carnation Revolution thus stands as an example of how internal exhaustion and disciplined restraint could dismantle an entrenched authoritarian system without provoking direct superpower confrontation, even as it unleashed secondary conflicts elsewhere, revealing the uneven geography of Cold War change, where peace in one arena could coincide with war in another. And as historians integrate Portugal's experience into the broader narrative of the era, its significance lies in how it exposed the fragility of authoritarian regimes, sustained by strategic utility rather than consent, and how it demonstrated that alliance cohesion could survive radical internal change when legitimacy was rebuilt rather than imposed. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution offers a critical insight into the Cold War's deeper dynamics, showing that the most transformative events were often those that unfolded quietly, driven by fatigue, disillusionment, and moral collapse rather than by force, yet whose consequences reshaped global alignments in ways that neither bloc fully anticipated. As the revolutionary decade closed and Portugal's democratic trajectory stabilized, the Carnation Revolution increasingly came to be understood not as an aberration, but as an early signal of a broader transformation underway within the Cold War system, because it revealed that authoritarian regimes embedded within alliances were not immune to collapse once their internal foundations eroded. And this mattered because it challenged the assumption that strategic alignment guaranteed political durability, exposing instead how legitimacy, once exhausted, could unravel systems that appeared externally secure. And Portugal's experience illustrated how prolonged colonial war had hollowed out the very institutions meant to sustain the state, leaving the military disillusioned, society fatigued, and the regime isolated. A convergence that made collapse not only possible, but inevitable once a credible alternative emerged. And this convergence mattered because it showed that the Cold War's internal pressures often accumulated invisibly, erupting suddenly when thresholds were crossed. And within NATO, the lesson was quietly absorbed, as policymakers recognized that supporting authoritarian stability carried long-term risks that could outweigh short-term strategic convenience, prompting a gradual reevaluation of how legitimacy and alliance cohesion interacted. And this reevaluation mattered because it foreshadowed later transitions where democratic reform would be seen not as a liability, but as a stabilizing force, even when it introduced uncertainty. And for Portugal, the revolution's legacy was ultimately one of reinvention, as the country redirected its identity toward Europe, institutionalized civilian control over the military, and normalized political competition, demonstrating that the collapse of empire and dictatorship need not result in permanent instability. And this outcome mattered because it offered a counterpoint to more violent Cold War transitions, showing that exhaustion and restraint could produce durable change without mass bloodshed. And yet the revolution's global consequences remained uneven, as the wars ignited by decolonization continued to shape African politics for decades, underscoring the paradox that peaceful transformation at the center could coincide with violent upheaval at the periphery. And this paradox mattered because it revealed how Cold War change redistributed rather than eliminated conflict, shifting its geography and form. And as historians reflect on the Carnation Revolution's place in the Cold War, its significance lies in how it exposed the limits of authoritarian endurance within a strategic alliance, demonstrated the decisive role of internal legitimacy crises, and showed that the Cold War's outcome was shaped not only by superpower confrontation, but by the collapse of systems exhausted by their own contradictions. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution stands as a reminder that some of the most consequential Cold War transformations occurred not through war or negotiation between blocs, but through the sudden implosion of regimes that could no longer sustain the burdens they imposed, altering global alignments through internal collapse rather than external defeat. As the long-term meaning of the Carnation Revolution settled into Cold War history, it became increasingly clear that Portugal's transformation represented a rare convergence of exhaustion, opportunity, and restraint, because the regime collapsed not under the weight of mass uprising or foreign pressure, but because the institutions designed to sustain it no longer believed in their own mission. And this mattered because it demonstrated that authoritarian systems can survive popular discontent for years, yet fail abruptly once their coercive core loses conviction, a dynamic that would later appear in other Cold War contexts. And in Portugal, this loss of conviction was rooted in the colonial wars, which had consumed a generation of officers and revealed the futility of imperial ambition in a world moving decisively toward decolonization, eroding the moral foundation of the state from within. And this erosion mattered because it severed the bond between the military and the regime, leaving the dictatorship defenseless at the moment of crisis. And within NATO, the peaceful nature of the revolution forced a recalibration of assumptions, because it showed that the collapse of an allied dictatorship did not automatically translate into strategic loss, and that democratic legitimacy could ultimately reinforce alliance cohesion more effectively than repression, even when the transition involved uncertainty and ideological contestation. And this lesson mattered because it quietly influenced Western responses to later internal crises, encouraging patience and political engagement rather than preemptive intervention. And for Portugal, the revolution's success lay not only in dismantling authoritarianism, but in institutionalizing restraint, embedding civilian supremacy over the military, and cultivating a political culture wary of extremism, shaped by the memory of how close the country had come to ideological capture and fragmentation. And this internal discipline mattered because it allowed Portugal's democracy to endure despite economic hardship and social disruption. And in the broader Cold War narrative, the Carnation Revolution occupies a distinctive place because it illustrates how systems can collapse from fatigue rather than defeat, and how legitimacy, once lost, cannot be restored by strategic usefulness alone. And as the Cold War drew toward its conclusion, Portugal's experience stood as an early indication that internal legitimacy crises would ultimately prove more decisive than external confrontation in reshaping global alignments, foreshadowing the cascade of transformations that would later unfold across Eastern Europe. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution must be understood not merely as a national turning point, but as a signal event that revealed the hidden fault lines within Cold War alliances, showing that stability enforced through inertia and fear could unravel overnight once the social and institutional foundations sustaining it gave way, and that when such collapse occurred, the most powerful forces shaping the outcome were often exhaustion, restraint, and the quiet withdrawal of belief rather than violence or ideology. As the final phase of the revolutionary transition unfolded, the Carnation Revolution's place within the Cold War became unmistakable, because it demonstrated that the endurance of alliances depended not only on external threat perception, but on the internal viability of the regimes that composed them. And this mattered because Portugal's dictatorship had long been tolerated as a strategic asset despite its political stagnation, revealing how Cold War priorities could obscure deep structural decay until collapse became unavoidable. And when that collapse came, it exposed how quickly a system could disintegrate once its military, economic, and moral foundations aligned against it. And this alignment mattered because it showed that revolutions need not be violent to be decisive, nor ideological to be transformative. And within Portugal, the consolidation of democratic institutions, completed a reorientation that replaced imperial identity with civic legitimacy, anchoring the country within a European democratic framework and redefining its role in the Atlantic Alliance. And this outcome mattered because it proved that internal political renewal could strengthen rather than weaken strategic cohesion, even when it dismantled long-standing arrangements. And in the wider Cold War context, the revolution served as a precursor to later legitimacy-driven collapses, illustrating how authoritarian systems sustained by fear and inertia could fall rapidly once belief eroded. And as historians assess the Carnation Revolution's legacy, its significance lies in how it revealed the Cold War's hidden vulnerabilities, not in the clash of armies or ideologies, but in the exhaustion of systems that could no longer justify their own survival. And by collapsing an empire, dissolving a dictatorship, and testing NATO's internal resilience without triggering superpower confrontation, the Carnation Revolution stands as a reminder that the Cold War was shaped as much by internal decay and restraint as by confrontation and force, marking it as one of the era's most instructive examples of how legitimacy, once lost, can bring even the most entrenched structures down with breathtaking speed. In closing, the Portuguese Carnation Revolution of 1974 stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing internal ruptures because it demonstrated how an authoritarian system embedded within a powerful alliance could collapse not through foreign pressure or mass violence, but through exhaustion, disillusionment, and the quiet withdrawal of belief by the very institutions meant to sustain it. And what makes this event so consequential is not the drama of the coup itself, but the speed with which decades of repression, censorship, and imperial ambition dissolved once the military concluded that the system it defended no longer had a future. And this mattered because it exposed a fundamental truth of the Cold War: that alignment with a superpower bloc could preserve regimes for a time, but could not compensate indefinitely for political stagnation, economic isolation, and the moral cost of endless colonial war. And Portugal's experience revealed how legitimacy, once depleted, could not be restored by strategic usefulness alone, leaving even long-standing dictatorships vulnerable to sudden collapse. And the peaceful nature of the revolution underscored this reality, because the absence of resistance signaled not strength, but abandonment, as the regime found itself without defenders when the moment of reckoning arrived. And the consequences of this collapse radiated outward, unraveling one of Europe's last empires, reshaping the Cold War battlegrounds of Africa, and forcing NATO to confront the instability that could emerge from within its own ranks. And yet the revolution also demonstrated the possibility of restraint, showing that a transition away from dictatorship need not descend into civil war or superpower confrontation, even under intense ideological pressure, provided that exhaustion, compromise, and institutional discipline prevailed. And in this sense, the Carnation Revolution offers a crucial counterpoint to more violent Cold War transformations, illustrating that internal collapse driven by legitimacy failure could produce durable change without catastrophic bloodshed. And as historians reflect on the Cold War's end, Portugal's experience stands as an early warning that the most decisive struggles of the era would be fought not only at borders or negotiating tables, but within societies whose patience had been consumed by systems that demanded sacrifice without offering renewal, and by collapsing overnight and reshaping global alignments through internal implosion rather than external defeat. The Carnation Revolution revealed how fragile authoritarian stability truly was, and how quickly an empire, a dictatorship, and an entire political order could vanish once belief evaporated, marking it as one of the Cold War's most instructive examples of how legitimacy, not force, ultimately determines the survival of states.